I'm Sarah, 32F, and my husband, Mark, 34M, and I just had our first baby, Jack. I knew labor would be tough, but it still caught me off guard. It felt like it went on forever, but the moment I held Jack in my arms, it was like the world stopped for a second. All the pain, all the exhaustion, it didn't matter anymore. He was here. Mark was right beside me, grinning ear to ear. In that moment, I really believed we were stepping into this new chapter of life together. But something changed in the days after we brought Jack home. At first, it seemed normal. Mark was exhausted, just like me. We weren't getting much sleep, adjusting to the chaos of having a newborn. I noticed Mark wasn't holding Jack, but I didn't think too much of it. I was doing most of the feedings, and Mark was busy cleaning up around the house. When I asked him about it, he shrugged it off and said he was worried he might drop him. Jack was so small and fragile, and I could tell Mark was nervous. I understood. The first time I held Jack, I was terrified I might do something wrong. So I didn't push. Mark said he was just tired and needed to adjust. He kept making little excuses. His hands were dirty from work. He was too tired. Jack was already settled with me. I figured he'd come around eventually. But a few days went by, then a week, and Mark still hadn't held Jack once. Every time I mentioned it, he'd come up with another reason, and then he'd get back to whatever he was doing. That's when I noticed he was spending a lot of time on his phone or disappearing into the garage to work on something. I started feeling like I was doing everything. Changing diapers, feeding Jack, calming him when he cried, while Mark stayed distant. It wasn't just physical distance either. He barely looked at Jack. When he did, it was like he wasn't really seeing him. It was strange, unsettling. One night, I walked into Jack's room and found Mark standing in the doorway, just staring at the crib. He looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. I asked if everything was okay, but he snapped at me, something completely out of character for him. He stormed out of the room without another word. That was the first time I really started to worry. I talked to my friend Emily about it. She has kids, and I thought maybe she'd have some advice. She suggested it might be something more serious, like postpartum depression in men. I didn't even know that was a thing. I mean, we always hear about moms struggling after birth, but I'd never thought about dads going through something similar. It made sense, though. Mark wasn't acting like himself, and he seemed anxious and withdrawn, especially around Jack. So I did what anyone in my situation would do. I went online. I spent hours scrolling through forums and reading posts from other moms going through similar things. There were stories about husbands who struggled with postpartum anxiety or depression. Some of them didn't bond with their babies right away, but eventually, with time and help, they came around. I started thinking maybe Mark just needed support. Maybe he was too afraid to admit he was struggling. When I finally brought it up, suggesting we try counseling, Mark got defensive. He told me I was blowing things out of proportion, that he just needed time. He brushed it off like it was nothing, but I knew it wasn't. Every day that passed, the gap between us seemed to grow wider. He wasn't connecting with Jack, and it felt like he was pulling further and further away from me too. It reached a breaking point one night when Jack wouldn't stop crying. I was so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open, and Mark was nowhere to be found. He was in the garage again, probably scrolling through his phone or tinkering with something to avoid being inside. After hours of trying to soothe Jack alone, I snapped. I marched into the garage and demanded to know what was going on. I needed to understand why he wouldn't hold our baby, why he was leaving everything to me. I was at my wit's end. But Mark just shut down. He wouldn't talk about it. He didn't even seem angry anymore, just blank. I remember standing there waiting for him to say something, anything, but all he did was turn away from me. That's when I started wondering if he regretted having a baby at all. Maybe this wasn't about fear or anxiety, maybe he just didn't want to be a dad. I tried to let it go, to give him space, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. It wasn't just that he was afraid of holding the baby. There was something deeper, something he wasn't telling me. I could feel it. And the more I thought about it, the more it ate away at me. A few days later, my mom came to visit. She could tell right away that something was off between Mark and me. She asked if everything was okay, but I brushed it off, not wanting to involve her in our problems. It was embarrassing. Really, here I was, supposed to be enjoying these first weeks as a new mom, but instead I was stuck in this mess, feeling more alone than ever. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. I just didn't know what it was yet. Update 1. After that first night when I found Mark staring at Jack's crib, things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. Mark withdrew even more. He was barely at home, either spending long hours at work or hanging out with friends. When he was home, he hardly spoke to me or even acknowledged Jack's existence. The gap between us kept growing, and I started feeling like I was living with a stranger. It wasn't just that he wasn't holding Jack anymore. He wasn't involved at all. I was doing everything, feeding, changing, soothing Jack when he cried. Meanwhile, Mark seemed content to stay on the sidelines, always distracted by something. It was either his phone or his work. The man who had once been so excited to be a father now barely looked at our son. I tried to figure out what was going on with him, but every time I brought it up, he brushed me off. "I'm just tired," he'd say, or "work is crazy right now." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. So one day, when he was out, I decided to check his phone. I'd never done anything like that before. We've always trusted each other, but I was desperate for answers. I felt guilty the whole time, scrolling through his messages and checking his browsing history, but I didn't find anything unusual. No suspicious messages, no shady websites, nothing. It was almost a relief, but at the same time, it left me even more confused. If there was nothing going on with someone else, then what was wrong? A few days later, while doing laundry, I made an accidental discovery. I was going through Mark's jacket pockets when I pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. I didn't even know he kept a journal. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, my heart racing. Part of me didn't want to invade his privacy, but another part of me was desperate for answers. I needed to know what was going on in his head. I opened it. The first entry was from just a few weeks before Jack was born. Mark had written about how nervous he was about becoming a father, how he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. That wasn't too surprising. I mean, who doesn't have doubts about becoming a parent? But as I read further, things started to take a darker turn. In later entries, Mark wrote about nightmares he'd been having, nightmares where something terrible happened to Jack. He mentioned waking up in a cold sweat, terrified that he might hurt the baby by accident. One entry in particular stopped me in my tracks. Mark hinted at a childhood memory that had haunted him for years. He didn't go into detail at first, but he said it had something to do with a baby, and it scared him. A lot. That night I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until Jack was asleep, and I confronted Mark about the journal. He was furious at first, yelling about how I'd invaded his privacy. I'd never seen him so angry before. But then, something changed. He stopped shouting, and suddenly he just broke down. He was shaking, trying to hold back tears, and that's when the truth started to come out. When Mark was 10 years old, he'd been playing with his baby cousin. He'd been holding the baby when he accidentally dropped him. The baby had cried, but Mark's family reassured him that everything was fine. Later, though, his cousin had developed complications. The family never directly blamed Mark, but he'd carried that guilt with him his whole life. It had left him traumatized, terrified that he'd hurt another baby. He told me that every time he looked at Jack, he couldn't shake the fear that he might accidentally harm him, just like what happened with his cousin. He didn't trust himself around Jack. That's why he'd been avoiding holding him, why he'd been staying away. It wasn't that he didn't love Jack, it was that he was terrified of hurting him. Hearing that hit me like a ton of bricks. On one hand, I was relieved. It wasn't that Mark didn't want to be a father. He did. But on the other hand, I was heartbroken for him. He had been suffering in silence for weeks, and I had no idea. I couldn't imagine how hard that must have been for him, carrying that burden alone. I knew we couldn't keep going like this. Mark needed help, real help. I suggested he see a therapist, and after some hesitation, he agreed. He didn't like the idea at first, but I think he realized that he couldn't keep living in fear like this. I hoped therapy would help him work through his trauma, and that, eventually, he'd be able to bond with Jack the way I knew he wanted to. His first therapy session seemed to go well. He came home a little quieter than usual, but there was a sense of relief in him, like he'd finally started to unpack some of the things he'd been holding inside. But even though he was going to therapy, Mark still wasn't interacting with Jack much. He'd sit in the same room, watch me feed or play with Jack, but he never really joined in. It was progress, but it was slow. Too slow. Meanwhile, I was feeling lonelier than ever. Even though Mark was finally getting help, I was still the one doing everything for Jack. The sleepless nights, the endless diaper changes, it was all on me. I tried to be patient, reminding myself that healing takes time. My friend Emily told me the same thing, encouraging me to hang in there. But it was hard. Some days I didn't know how much longer I could keep going like this. Update 2. Over the next few weeks, Mark started attending therapy regularly. At first, he didn't share much about the sessions with me, but I could tell something was shifting. He seemed lighter, like he wasn't carrying that same weight of guilt he had been for so long. His therapist was helping him not only face his fear of harming Jack, but also uncover deeper issues, feelings of inadequacy that he had never talked about before. Mark began opening up more about the incident with his cousin. He explained how he had carried that guilt for years, always believing that he had been responsible for what happened. No one in his family had really talked about it after the initial accident, so Mark had been left to deal with his emotions on his own. He said he'd always felt like it was something he couldn't escape, like it defined him in some way. I could tell that talking about it in therapy was helping, but it was a slow process. Then one day, his therapist suggested that I come to one of Mark's sessions. It was a little nerve-wracking to walk into that space, knowing how vulnerable Mark had been in there, but I agreed. During the session, the therapist talked about the importance of co-parenting, how Mark and I needed to rebuild trust, not just in our relationship but in our ability to parent together. Mark still struggled to be hands-on with Jack, but just hearing him acknowledge that he wanted to change gave me some hope. A few nights later, I was feeding Jack on the couch when Mark came and sat down next to us. He didn't say anything, but he was right there, watching quietly. It was the closest he had been to Jack in weeks. He didn't hold him, but it was a step. I wasn't sure if it meant anything long-term, but for that moment it felt like progress. Small, but it was something. As we slowly began reconnecting emotionally, Mark and I started talking more. We were honest about how the last few months had been. I think it helped both of us to finally have those conversations without the tension that had built up before. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first time in a while that I felt like we were on the same page, like we were working towards something together. Then, out of nowhere, there was another setback. One night, Mark woke up in a panic after having a nightmare about his cousin again. He barely spoke to me the next day, retreating back into himself. It felt like we were right back where we started. I didn't know what to do, and honestly, I was starting to feel like I couldn't handle everything on my own anymore. That's when I realized I needed help too. I decided to start seeing a counselor for myself. I was exhausted from carrying the emotional and physical load of caring for Jack and dealing with Mark's struggles. My own feelings of loneliness and resentment had been building up, and I knew I needed a space to work through that. Around this time, Mark's mother came to visit. She hadn't seen us since Jack was born, and it didn't take long for her to notice the tension in the house. She didn't say much during her visit, but when I explained what had been happening, she looked shocked. She didn't press Mark on it, but I could tell she was concerned. A few days later, Mark's mother called me. She had something she needed to tell me but didn't want to share it in front of Mark just yet. That's when she dropped a bombshell. She told me that there was more to the story about Mark's cousin than Mark knew. The cousin had a pre-existing medical condition that no one had mentioned to Mark. While the fall had been traumatic, it wasn't what caused the long-term complications. Mark had been blaming himself all these years for something that wasn't his fault. I wasn't sure how to tell Mark. I knew he deserved to know the truth, but I also worried that it might overwhelm him, especially now that he was just starting to make progress in therapy. After thinking it over for a few days, I decided to tell him. When I finally shared what his mom had told me, Mark didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, staring off into space. I could see him processing everything, trying to make sense of it. After a long pause, he started crying. He said he felt relieved, but also confused. He had spent so much of his life believing he was responsible for what happened. Now that he knew the truth, it was like his whole perspective had shifted, but it didn't erase the years of guilt he had carried. In his next therapy session, Mark brought up what his mom had told us. His therapist helped him begin to process this new information, but it was clear that while it was a relief to know the truth, Mark still had a long way to go in working through his feelings of inadequacy as a father. It was a breakthrough, but not a solution. Then, one evening, something incredible happened. Mark finally worked up the courage to hold Jack for the first time. I was feeding Jack when Mark quietly came over and asked if he could hold him. I handed Jack over, and I could see the nervousness on Mark's face. His hands were shaking a little, but the moment he held Jack, something shifted. There was so much emotion in his eyes, fear, love, relief. It was all there. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. That moment felt like a glimmer of hope. It was small, but it was significant. For the first time in a long time, I believed that we might actually be able to heal as a family, that Mark would be able to bond with Jack in time. We weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in months, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Update 3. After the breakthrough when Mark finally held Jack, I thought we were on the right track. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like progress. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that things might start getting better. But not long after, I noticed Mark slipping back into his old patterns. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things, like how he stopped sitting with me when I fed Jack, or how he seemed distracted again. His old fears crept back in, and just like before, he started pulling away. At first, I thought maybe it was just a bad day or two, but then it became clear that something else was going on. Mark started talking about how stressed he was at work. He'd recently taken on more responsibilities, and the pressure was getting to him. He said he felt like he was drowning, trying to balance work and fatherhood. The anxiety that had lessened for a bit now seemed worse than ever. He wasn't just afraid of hurting Jack anymore. Now he was also terrified that he couldn't provide for us or be the father he was supposed to be. The tension between us became harder to ignore. We started arguing more, about everything. It wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about the house, the bills, the little things that didn't even matter. I could tell we were both under immense stress, but instead of leaning on each other, we were clashing. Every argument seemed to spiral out of control. It felt like the unresolved emotional strain that Mark had been carrying for months was now spilling over into our marriage. Then one night, Mark told me he was canceling his therapy sessions. He said they weren't helping him anymore, that talking about his fears wasn't fixing anything. I was stunned. Therapy had been the only thing holding us together, the only thing that seemed to be giving him some relief, and now he was ready to walk away from it. That was the moment I realized just how serious things had gotten. Without therapy, I didn't know how we were going to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, I was starting to feel more isolated than ever. My friends noticed that I wasn't around as much. Emily asked why I hadn't come to any of the recent meetups, and I had to admit that I was too overwhelmed with everything happening at home. I felt like I didn't have the energy to maintain my friendships anymore. All I could think about was Mark, Jack, and how I was going to keep everything together. Mark started making excuses again for not holding Jack, but this time it wasn't about fear. Now it was work. He was too tired, too drained, or too busy, and I was left to handle it all, just like before. I had been patient for as long as I could, but that patience was running out. One night, after hours of trying to calm a crying Jack, I snapped. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told Mark that he was abandoning us, that he was leaving me to do all the work while he checked out emotionally. I was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally, and I couldn't keep doing this alone. The argument that followed was one of the worst we'd ever had. Mark got defensive, saying I didn't understand the pressure he was under. Things escalated quickly, and we both said things we shouldn't have. I don't even remember half of what was said, but it didn't matter because by the end of it, Mark stormed out of the house. He didn't come back that night. I sat there feeling completely abandoned, wondering if our marriage was even salvageable at this point. I didn't know what to do. Desperation kicked in, and I decided to reach out to Mark's therapist. I knew it wasn't my place, but I was terrified of where things were headed. The therapist couldn't tell me much, of course, but she did suggest that Mark's trauma might run deeper than we initially thought and that I needed to focus on my own well-being too. Hearing that made me realize that I couldn't keep sacrificing my own mental health for the sake of trying to fix Mark. Something had to change, and it wasn't just about him anymore. I turned to my mom for advice. She's always been my rock, and I needed someone to tell me what to do. When I told her everything that had been going on, she didn't hold back. She told me I needed to set firmer boundaries with Mark. She said I couldn't keep letting his issues consume me, that I had to protect myself and Jack. It was tough to hear, but she was right. She suggested that I give Mark an ultimatum. Either he got serious about dealing with his problems, or I had to start considering separation for the sake of my own sanity. That night, when Mark finally came home, we had a heart-to-heart. I laid everything out, telling him that I couldn't keep living like this. I told him that if he wasn't going to get the help he needed, I would have to make some hard decisions for myself and for Jack. It wasn't an easy conversation, and at first Mark resisted. He insisted that therapy wasn't the answer, and that he just needed more time to figure things out. But I stood firm. I couldn't wait around anymore, hoping things would magically get better. After hours of back and forth, Mark broke down in tears. He admitted that he felt like he was failing as a father, as a husband. He said he didn't know how to fix things, but he knew he couldn't keep going the way he had been. It was heartbreaking to see him so vulnerable, but at the same time, it was a relief. At least he was finally opening up again. Still, I wasn't sure if this was just another temporary breakthrough, or if it would lead to real, lasting change. All I could do was wait and see what happened next. Update 4. A few days after I gave Mark the ultimatum, he reluctantly agreed to return to therapy. But this time, he insisted on going alone. He told me he needed to face his issues without me there, that he had to figure things out on his own. I didn't argue, though deep down I was worried. I wasn't sure if this was a step forward, or if it was his way of shutting me out again. With Mark back in therapy and increasingly focused on his job, I found myself basically parenting Jack alone. He was still helping here and there, but the day-to-day care was on me. I'd hoped things would improve quickly, but they didn't. Mark's workload seemed to increase overnight. He was traveling more, staying late at the office, and when he was home, he was so drained that he barely had the energy to engage. I'd watch him collapse on the couch after a long day, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was our new normal, me handling everything while Mark drifted further away. About a month after he returned to therapy, I noticed some small changes. Mark spent more time at home on the weekends, and he even started helping with Jack's diapers. He would sit on the floor and play with Jack for a few minutes, but there was always this unspoken limit. He never held him for long, never really bonded beyond the bare minimum. It was progress, but it still felt like something was missing. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I had this nagging feeling that we weren't addressing the root of the problem. During this time, I made an effort to reconnect with my friends. I'd been so caught up in everything with Mark and Jack that I'd let my social life completely fall apart. Emily invited me out for coffee one morning, and it felt good to talk about everything that had been happening. She listened as I opened up about the strain in my marriage, the constant worry about whether or not Mark would ever fully come back to us. Emily, as always, gave solid advice. She reminded me to focus on myself and Jack and let Mark figure out his own way back. But it was easier said than done. Another issue started creeping up: money. Mark was still going to therapy and the bills were adding up. On top of that, his reduced hours at work weren't helping our financial situation. We had savings, but the constant strain of balancing therapy costs with everything else was starting to worry me. I didn't know how much longer we could keep this up. The weight of it all, Mark's slow progress, the financial stress, my own growing exhaustion, was pressing down on me, and I wasn't sure how much more I could take. Then one evening, Mark finally opened up about what had been happening in therapy. He said his therapist had been digging deeper into his childhood, helping him confront long-buried feelings of guilt and shame. It was the first time in weeks that he'd shared any real details with me, and for a brief moment, I felt hopeful. Maybe he was finally getting to the core of his issues. But even with his openness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still being left unsaid. I kept wondering if his trauma around the baby incident was really the only issue, or if there was more he wasn't ready to talk about. Our communication started breaking down again. Mark would go silent for days after his therapy sessions, withdrawing into himself like he had before. I tried to be patient, but the more he pulled away, the more isolated I felt. We'd have brief moments of connection, but they were always fleeting, and before I knew it, he'd retreat again. I was starting to feel like I was living with a stranger. One night, feeling completely lost, I reached out to Mark's therapist. I knew I wasn't supposed to, but I couldn't take it anymore. The therapist didn't tell me much, citing confidentiality, but she did suggest that Mark's progress would be slow and that I needed to prepare myself for a long journey. It wasn't exactly comforting, but at least it gave me some idea of what to expect. Still, I wasn't sure how long I could wait for things to get better. Then, as if we weren't already dealing with enough, there was another setback. During a family dinner, Mark completely shut down. He barely touched his food and sat there in silence. When I asked if something was wrong, he mumbled something about not being ready to be a father and then locked himself in his office for the rest of the night. It felt like we were right back at square one. To make matters worse, a few days later, Jack developed a high fever. I panicked and rushed him to the ER, but Mark was unreachable. He was on a work trip and didn't pick up his phone. I spent the night in the hospital holding Jack as he recovered, and in those long, quiet hours, something in me broke. I realized I couldn't keep doing this, carrying the weight of our family alone while Mark's issues consumed everything. I had been patient, supportive, and understanding for so long, but now I was at my breaking point. As I sat there in the hospital, watching Jack sleep, I started to seriously consider if I could stay in this marriage. I loved Mark, and I wanted our family to work, but I couldn't keep sacrificing myself in the process. I began quietly researching legal steps for separation. It felt like a betrayal just thinking about it, but I had to be realistic. If Mark couldn't face his demons and fully come back to us, I had to protect myself and Jack. It wasn't a decision I wanted to make, but I couldn't ignore the possibility anymore. Something had to change, and soon. Update W5. When Mark returned home after his work trip, he looked shaken. The moment he heard about Jack's health scare, he apologized profusely for not being there. He kept saying he should have been reachable, that he hadn't realized things would get so bad. But no matter how sorry he seemed, I couldn't shake the growing resentment I felt. This wasn't the first time he had checked out when I needed him most, and I was tired of it. That night, after we finally got Jack settled, I sat Mark down for a serious talk. I had been holding it in for weeks, but it was time to say what had been on my mind. I told him I had been thinking about separation. The words hung in the air between us, and I could see the shock on his face. He hadn't expected it, but I explained that I couldn't keep doing this, parenting alone, handling all the emotional weight, while he stayed distant. I told him how hurtful his withdrawal had been, not just for me but for our family. Mark was quiet for a long time, and for a second, I thought he might not respond at all. But then, out of nowhere, he started pleading with me. He begged me to reconsider, promising that he would do better, that he just needed more time. He admitted he had been overwhelmed, scared even, but he said he didn't want to lose us. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. This wasn't just about fatherhood anymore. He was scared of losing me and Jack. It was a turning point, not just in the conversation, but in our relationship. I could tell that this wasn't the same surface level fear he had been carrying before. This was real, and it hit him hard. The next day, Mark made a surprising decision. He went into work and told them he needed to take an extended leave. He said he wanted to focus on his therapy and his family. He admitted to me later that he had been using work as an escape, a way to avoid facing the real issues at home. For so long, he had buried himself in his job to avoid dealing with his fears, but now he knew he couldn't keep running from it. It was a bold move and one I didn't expect, but it gave me hope that he was finally ready to confront what was really going on. Mark committed to an intensive therapy program. This time, it wasn't just about his childhood trauma. It was also focused on his role as a father and how to cope with the fears and anxieties that had been holding him back. He also agreed to involve me in more of the sessions, which was a huge step forward. It felt like for the first time, he was truly trying to rebuild our family, not just fix his own internal struggles. The changes didn't happen overnight, but slowly Mark began to show up in small but meaningful ways. He started helping with the nighttime feedings, something he had never done before. He spent more time bonding with Jack, though it was still a slow process. I could see that he was nervous, but he didn't let that stop him. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. At my suggestion, we also started attending marriage counseling. The sessions were tough. Emotions ran high, and there were moments when I wasn't sure if we could make it through. But for the first time, we were addressing the deeper issues in our marriage, the ones that had been festering beneath the surface for so long. Mark began to express his fears more openly, and I shared how his withdrawal had affected me. Slowly, we started rebuilding trust, brick by brick. One afternoon, something incredible happened. Jack took his first steps while Mark was home. It was such a small moment, but for us it was huge. Mark was sitting on the floor when Jack wobbled over to him, his little legs shaky but determined. Mark's face lit up, and when he scooped Jack into his arms, he cried. I hadn't seen him hold Jack like that without hesitation before. It was a turning point, not just for their relationship but for our family as a whole. It was the first time I believed that Mark was truly connecting with Jack. Even with all this progress, I stayed guarded. I couldn't afford to get too comfortable just yet. Things were improving, yes, but I knew we still had a long way to go. There were still moments when Mark would retreat into his own thoughts, and I had to remind myself that healing takes time. But for now, I was hopeful. I also continued seeing my own therapist. I had realized that, in order to keep our marriage strong, I needed to maintain my sense of self outside of it. I couldn't let my identity be consumed by everything that was happening with Mark and Jack. Focusing on my own well-being helped me find balance and kept me from getting lost in the emotional ups and downs of our family's journey. One major challenge we faced was the financial strain of Mark being on leave. The therapy bills were piling up, and with Mark working less, we were starting to feel the pressure. Our savings helped cushion the blow, but I worried about how long we could sustain this. We made some adjustments, cut back where we could, and tried to be mindful of our spending. It wasn't easy, but we managed. Still, the financial stress was always in the back of my mind, and I knew it was something we'd have to deal with sooner rather than later. For now, though, we were focused on healing. Mark was making an effort, and while it wasn't always smooth sailing, we were moving in the right direction. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about figuring out how to live again as a family. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like that was actually possible.